Hello horror enthusiasts, we are continuing with Detective Adrian Moore's story and his investigation in Ashwick. Please like and subscribe and ring that bell to be notified of future updates. Previous chapters will be added to the description. Let's get started. Chapter 2. Ashwick's Silence. The next morning, Detective Adrian Moore awoke in the cold, dim light filtering through the thin, stained curtains of his room at the inn. His sleep had been shallow, disturbed by the howling wind and the constant roar of the sea. More than once, he'd woken up with the unsettling feeling that something was watching him from the shadows. The vague unease from his dream, the dark, restless sea, the strange call that echoed in his mind, had not left him. If anything, it had only intensified. Ashwick felt like a place out of time, a forgotten corner of the world where the ordinary rules didn't apply. He had felt it the moment he crossed the town's boundary, and now, in the early light of day, that sense of something being deeply wrong had only sharpened. He dressed quickly and descended the creaking staircase to the lobby. The innkeeper was already there, sitting in the same spot behind the counter, watching him with those sunken, pale eyes. He hadn't moved since the night before, as if the passage of time meant nothing here. A thin wisp of steam rose from the cup of tea in his hands, but his gaze was fixed on Adrian, tracking him without blinking. "Sleep well," the old man rasped, his voice like gravel grinding in a hollow space. Adrian gave a curt nod, though the truth was far from it. There was no point in small talk here. The innkeeper's hollow eyes unnerved him, and something in the old man's demeanor suggested he already knew the answer to his question. Without another word, Adrian stepped out into the cool morning air. The town of Ashwick seemed even quieter in the daylight, its streets almost completely deserted. The narrow cobbled roads wound through clusters of old stone buildings, their walls stained with salt from the sea air. Many of the houses looked abandoned, their shutters drawn tight, and the few people he did see moved with strange, hurried steps, as if they were eager to avoid being seen. There was no chatter, no signs of the usual bustling activity of a small town. No children playing, no vendors shouting, no fishermen preparing for the day's catch. The only sound was the ever-present crashing of the waves against the cliffs, a dull, rhythmic beat that seemed to pulse through the town itself. Adrian turned up his collar against the chill as he made his way through the streets, his eyes scanning the quiet town for signs of life. The town square, if it could even be called that, was little more than a widened section of road where the town's few shops clustered together. Most of them were shuttered, their windows dark, and the few that remained open had little to offer beyond basic supplies. A faded, weather-worn sign creaked in the breeze outside a small general store, but as Adrian approached, the owner inside quickly turned the open sign to closed. That was the second shop to do that since he had arrived. Adrian sighed, feeling the weight of isolation pressing down on him. Something was wrong here. Very wrong. He could feel it in the way the townsfolk avoided his gaze, in the way they seemed to vanish when he walked past, as if they were afraid of being caught looking at him. He couldn't shake the sensation that they were hiding something they were desperate to keep from outsiders. As he walked, Adrian began to notice subtle things that unsettled him even more. There were markings carved into the stone walls of several buildings, small, almost invisible symbols that looked like they had been etched long ago. They were faded, barely discernible beneath layers of weathering, but something about them tugged at his memory. They weren't like anything he had seen before, and yet there was a strange familiarity to them, as if they belonged to a forgotten language or a forgotten religion. He made a mental note to investigate them later. He also noticed the way the air seemed to thicken as he got closer to the sea. The farther he walked toward the cliffside, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. The wind carried a briny, sour tang, mixing with the salty air in a way that was unpleasant. It left a bitter taste on his tongue, as though the sea itself was rotting, as though the water was sick. By midday, Adrian found himself standing outside a small church perched near the edge of the cliffs. Its weathered stone walls were covered in ivy, and its steeple rose high into the gray sky, a solitary figure against the backdrop of the churning ocean. The church was the only building in town that seemed well kept, and despite its isolation, there was something about it that drew Adrian in. It stood as a bastion of some unspoken belief, though what that belief was, Adrian could not yet say. He pushed open the heavy wooden door and stepped inside. The interior of the church was dimly lit, its narrow stained-glass windows casting muted colors onto the stone floor. The pews were old and worn, the wood polished smooth by decades of use, though they now sat empty. At the far end of the church, a man in simple priest's robes knelt before the altar, his back to Adrian. The priest, hearing the door creak, stood slowly and turned to face him. Father Ellison was a tall, gaunt man with a weathered face that matched the town itself. His eyes were pale, almost colorless, and they seemed to glisten with an unspoken fear as they met Adrian's gaze. "Detective Moore, I assume?" Father Ellison's voice was soft but carried a weight of expectation, as though he had been waiting for this encounter for some time. Adrian nodded, stepping forward, his eyes scanning the church. "You knew I was coming?" Father Ellison smiled faintly, though there was no warmth in it. Word travels fast in a place like Ashwick. "I'm investigating the disappearances," Adrian said, his voice direct. "Tourists have gone missing. Several, according to what I've been told. What do you know about it?" The priest's expression darkened, and for a moment he hesitated. Adrian saw the flicker of fear behind his eyes, the brief flash of uncertainty before Father Ellison spoke again. "There are things you should know about Ashwick, detective," Father Ellison said quietly. "Things that are better left alone." Adrian raised an eyebrow, his curiosity piqued. "Better left alone? These are people who have vanished, Father. Their families need answers." Father Ellison lowered his gaze, his hands trembling slightly as they gripped the edge of the altar. "The sea has taken them," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Just as it has taken so many before." Adrian frowned, leaning in closer. "The sea?" The priest nodded slowly, his eyes distant, as though he were seeing something far away, something beyond the reach of understanding. "The sea is not just water, detective. It is an ancient force, older than the land itself. It hungers." Adrian felt a chill creep down his spine. "You're saying the sea took them? What are you talking about?" Father Ellison turned away, his face pale and haunted. "This town has lived in the shadow of the sea for centuries. The ocean gives and it takes. It has always been that way. The people of Ashwick, they understand that. They know the price that must be paid." "Price?" Adrian asked, his voice growing sharper. "What kind of price are we talking about here?" "Sacrifice." The priest remained silent for a moment, his hands gripping the altar tighter. When he spoke again, his voice was barely more than a whisper. "The Deep One." Adrian's pulse quickened. "The Deep One? What is that, some kind of myth?" Father Ellison's face was grim as he met Adrian's gaze. "Not a myth. A truth. An old truth. The Deep One sleeps beneath the waves, but its presence is always there, waiting, watching. The town has learned to coexist with it, but sometimes it hungers." Adrian felt the familiar frustration rising in his chest. Cryptic answers. Always cryptic answers. "You're not making sense," Adrian said, his voice tight with impatience. "Is this some kind of local superstition? Something the town believes in?" Father Ellison shook his head. "It is more than belief. The disappearances are not random. They are chosen. The sea, it calls to them and they go." Adrian's jaw tightened. "And you're saying the townspeople know this? They're letting people disappear." The priest's eyes flickered with something unreadable. Fear, guilt, maybe both. "They understand the cost, detective. They know better than to interfere." Adrian took a step closer, his voice low and intense. "And you? Do you believe this? Do you believe the sea is taking people?" Father Ellison didn't answer. He turned back to the altar, bowing his head as though in silent prayer. Adrian stood there for a long moment, watching him, feeling a growing sense of unease. This was no ordinary town, and whatever was happening here, it was far beyond the realm of anything he had encountered before. "I suggest you leave, Detective," Father Ellison said softly, his voice distant. "Before it's too late." Adrian's fists clenched at his sides, his frustration simmering just beneath the surface. But he said nothing more. Instead, he turned and left the church, his mind racing with questions. The priest had given him just enough to confirm his suspicions. Something was terribly wrong in Ashwick, and the disappearances were not random. But the idea of the sea calling to people, taking them, was absurd. And yet, as absurd as it sounded, there was something about the way Father Ellison had spoken, something about the haunted look in his eyes, that made Adrian uneasy. He had dealt with plenty of superstitions and strange beliefs over the years, but this felt different. It felt real. As Adrian continued his investigation, the town grew even quieter, as if the very streets themselves were holding their breath. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of salt water and decay, and the waves crashed louder against the cliffs, as if in warning. By late afternoon, he found himself standing at the edge of the town, where the cliffs dropped sharply into the sea below. The water churned violently, the foam from the waves spraying into the air. The wind whipped at his coat, and for a moment, Adrian felt a strange pull, a pull toward the sea, as if something beneath the waves was watching him, waiting for him to come closer. He shook the feeling off, though it lingered like an itch he couldn't quite scratch. As he turned to leave, he caught sight of a figure standing farther down the cliffs, their back to him, staring out at the ocean. The figure stood completely still, unmoving, despite the harsh wind that whipped at their clothes. Adrian's instincts flared. He took a step closer, squinting against the setting sun, but before he could call out, the figure disappeared into the mist. Just like that, gone as if they had never been there. Adrian's heart raced as he stared at the spot where the figure had been standing. The sea below continued to roar, indifferent to the growing sense of dread that gnawed at him. Something was here, lurking just beneath the surface of this town. And whatever it wasn't finished yet. Thank you for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe. Let me know your favorite Eldritch horror story. Also, what stories would you like me to put in the pipeline? And again, stay safe and be vigilant as the night hides the unseen.